We're on our flight from Gatwick to Barbados, and we're now going to start our panel scan. We begin on the overhead, on the aft segment of the captain's side, and we work our way in a sort of W shape around the panel. So first of all we come to the electrical engine controls. We'll be looking at all of these features in later videos, and I'll be explaining how the various systems work. But for now, the EECs, which control and monitor the engines and among other things provide us with the auto start function, these are to be in the normal position and guarded. Coming then to the IRS selectors, we turn these from off through the align position into nav. We'll feed the aircraft's current position into the system via the FMS, and you'll see how we do that shortly. Then coming down to the electrical panel, the utility switches need to be on. Bus tie switches in auto. This allows the automatic interconnectivity of the AC bus bars in the event of a fault. And the Gen Cont switches, which are basically the master switches to the generators, the engine driven generators. These are on and are always left in the on position unless there's a malfunction. You'll also notice the amber off lights, which are perfectly normal at this stage because of course the generators and the engines are not online. The drive disconnect lights are also illuminated for the same reason. On the hydraulic panel, all the system fault and pressure lights should be illuminated. Again, the systems aren't energized at this stage, so this is perfectly normal. The demand pumps are all off, and the engine driven pump switches are always left in the on position unless there's a fault. And the amber pressure lights are illuminated, again because the engines aren't online at the moment. Back to the rear of the panel, checking the emergency lights are armed, and we do this by simply replacing the guard on the switch. Observer audio system is in normal. Service interphone, which is a ground function used by the engineers, that can be turned off, and the main transfer 1 and 4 switch is also off. If we move down to the fire panel, I'm just going to change the angle here slightly so that you can get a good view of the controls. We're basically looking to make sure that all the fire handles are in and there is no illumination on this panel at all, or on the cargo fire panel, making sure the discharge light isn't illuminated and there are no lights in the switches. On the start panel, again we're looking for no lights in the ignition switches. The standby ignition switch should be in normal. Continuous ignition is off. The auto ignition selector should be in single, and the auto start push button we have on in preparation for engine start. All normal engine starts should be done using the auto start feature, unless of course you're flying one of the older model 400s which don't have the auto start feature. Fuel jettison panel should have no lights illuminated in the nozzle switches, and the jettison selector should be in the off position. Then coming down to the fuel, we need all crossfeeds to be on at this stage, and that's shown with the white piping light shown in each push button, and there are no valve lights shown in the cross-feed push buttons. All of the main tank pumps should be showing the amber pressure light because they're not online at this stage, and all of the pumps at this stage should be turned off. We don't have pressure lights or any other lights showing in the override pump switches or the switches for the centre or stabiliser tanks. If the APU is running, you'll notice that the main 2 and 3 aft pumps will not show the amber pressure light. These will be running automatically to provide fuel pressure for the APU. Then moving down to the anti-icing panel, all of the selectors should be in auto. If you're operating an aircraft with the manual push button anti-ice selectors, then obviously the anti-icing should be off at this stage. But if you have the automatic anti-icing function, as this aircraft does, then all of the switches are left in auto. To the right of there, checking the wipers are off and the window heat selectors are both on and no fault lights illuminated. We then go to the aft part of the first officer's side of the panel. Passenger oxygen should be guarded in the normal position so that the system can automatically deploy the oxygen masks in the cabin should a depressurization be detected. Yaw dampers should be selected on, and then we're looking at the cabin altitude panel, making sure that the landing altitude switch should be in the automatic position, so it shouldn't be depressed. The outflow valve left and right switches should be off. The cabin altitude selector should be in normal, and the outflow valves should be showing open, and the position of the valves are shown on these gauges. Further down on the environmental control system panel, the temperature selectors we're looking to be in auto at this stage. The zone reset light should be extinguished. We want the trim air and both recirculation fans to be selected on. The equipment cooling should be in normal. High flow is not required as we're not operating in hot conditions with particularly high passenger loads. And the gasper switch should be on. This provides air to the individual gasper units above the head of each passenger. And then we come to the bleed section. So the pack reset push button should be extinguished with no lights in it. The pack selectors can be selected in normal at this stage. Just going to move again so you can get a better view of the panel itself. The isolation switches we always have on and the valve lights extinguished, and all of the bleed selectors are left in the on position so that when the APU and eventually the engines come online, they will automatically provide bleed air for the air conditioning, and also making sure that the system fault lights are extinguished. As for the lighting panel on the leading edge of the overhead, you can set the internal lights to your heart's desire. If you're operating at night, then you'll want to make some selections on here. As for the external lights, the only ones we really need to have on during the day are the nav lights at this stage. Everything else needs to be off, including the landing lights, the turn-off lights, the taxi light, the beacon, and the strobes. If you're operating at night, you may want to turn the wing light on so that the external inspection of the wings can be done at night. And also, if you're flying at night, you may want to turn on the logo light, which will light up the logo on the tailplane of the aircraft. So that's it for the overhead. Let's move down now to the main panel, start having a look at that. We then move down to the main panel. We're going to test the crew oxygen system first of all to make sure it's working. We'll select the status page on the ICAS and note the current oxygen pressure. You can see it's 1840 psi here. Anything above 1200 I believe is acceptable for dispatch. We're then also going to select the overhead speaker and the flight interphone option on the audio control panel, and you'll see why in a moment. And we'll go over to the oxygen selector itself, selecting the reset test switch first of all, and making sure there's a yellow momentary cross in the display. We're then going to depress it again in conjunction with the emergency test selector. You can see a continuous flow is shown in the yellow cross, and you can hear the continuous flow as well. We're also going to use the intercom switch here, and you can hear the flow on the overhead speaker. The test needs to be held for about 10 seconds. We're then going to cross-check on the ICAS screen that the pressure has not reduced by more than 100 psi. And we'll also note the final remaining pressure and make sure that it's sufficient for flight. Once the selectors have both been released, the yellow cross should then disappear. Continuing our look at the main panel, all of the source selectors should be in the 12 o'clock position. The clock should be showing the correct UTC time and adjusted if necessary. You can see the instrumentation hasn't yet appeared on the primary flight display or the navigation display. That's because we haven't inserted our current position into the flight management system yet. We'll do that in a moment. We can, however, at this stage set the altimeter with the correct QNH. Both primary flight display altimeters should be within 35 feet of each other, and both should be displaying within 75 feet of the airfield elevation. We're 220 feet here at Gatwick, so that's looking pretty good. The auto brake selector can at this stage be in RTO in preparation for takeoff. We're cross-checking the standby instruments here. We can cage the artificial horizon if necessary, and also checking the correct QNH is set on the standby altimeter. If you're operating an aircraft with the ISFD, the digital combined standby instrument, rather than these analog standby instruments, then you should be checking that there are no flags or messages in the ISFD. The EFIS control panel could be set really according to preference. We will need the TCAS display showing, and you'll notice that this brings up a TCAS off flag on the navigation display, which is normal at this stage. The transponder is currently in standby. I usually like to have the airport display showing, and you need to make sure that the weather radar is not selected at this stage. The weather radar should not be selected until you're entering the departure runway. This is to ensure that personnel are working around the aircraft are not harmed in any way by the radiation coming from the radar itself. On the MCP, we'll be making selections on this later on, but the flight directors need to be on at this stage. Auto throttle in the arm position, and you can also preemptively select the departure runway track. We're going off 26 left today, so I'm going to set the initial track 258 degrees, and you can also preemptively select the initial climb for the departure, which for us today is going to be 4,000 feet. We'll be making selections in the speed window a little bit later on. On the first officer's side, we're making pretty much the same checks as we did on the captain's side. And if you have FS2 crew, which I thoroughly recommend because it is very unrealistic really to operate something as big and complex as a 747 in the sim entirely on your own. So if you have FS2 crew, the first officer will look after his own side. Nevertheless, if you are on your own, you want to check that all of the lights are extinguished on the ground proximity panel and the switch is guarded. You want to check on the ICAS control panel that the ERU selector is in auto. The heading switch is in normal, and the FMC master switch is on the left. Also looking at the alternate flap selector, we've already looked at that as part of the security check. We've already looked at this as part of the safety inspection, but needs to be off and no lights illuminated in the arm push button. No indications either in the alternate gear extension switches, and these are guarded. Checking that the gear lever is down, and a down indication showing on the upper ICAS screen. And then on the lower ICAS screen we can check the hydraulic quantities, making sure that the RF legend isn't displayed next to any of the hydraulic system readouts. This suggests that a refill is required. We can also go to the engine page and check the oil quantities for each engine. If these are below the quantity required for dispatch, they will show in magenta. We can then move down to the pedestal. We're going to leave the flight management computers for the moment. Going to make sure that the speed brakes are in the down position. Thrust levers are closed in idle, and the reverse thrust levers are stowed. Fuel cut-off switches need to be in the cut-off position, and the stab trim cut-out switches guarded. The parking brake should also be selected, but be aware that the accumulator pressure, which is shown on the main panel here, may not be sufficient to actually apply and hold the parking brake. So if this is the case, when you've set the parking brake, the park brake set legend may not appear on the upper ICAS screen here in white. To see if the legend is shown on the ICAS screen, we can cancel some of the alerts that we have here on the upper ICAS, and we're checking them, making sure there are no alerts at this stage that we weren't expecting. You can see on the upper ICAS that we have more than one page of alerts at this stage, and this is perfectly normal. Most of the systems aren't in operation because the engines are shut down. All of these alerts we were expecting, so we can cancel them. Checking page 2, and again we're expecting all of these alerts really. None of the systems listed are in operation. And finally checking page 3 of the alerts, and once again these are all fairly normal at this stage, so we can cancel those. What we're left with are status messages essentially, and you can see that one of them is park brake set, so we do have enough accumulator pressure to apply the parking brake, but you need to be aware that sometimes pressure will have bled out of the system, perhaps if the aircraft hasn't been used for a while, and this means that even when you apply the parking brake, it may not actually physically apply, and the ICAS message may not be shown. If this is the case, then obviously you need to make sure that the engineers keep the chocks in to prevent the aircraft from moving until we can pressurise the hydraulics and reinstate some pressure back into the accumulator. Moving down, we can make the appropriate frequency selections on the radio tuning panels. We'll usually be guarding the emergency frequency 1215 on the right when we're in flight, but you can make the appropriate selections as necessary. You may want to listen to the ATIS frequency, in which case you can select that on the first officer's side. And also make the necessary selections on the audio control panel so that you're transmitting and listening to the right things. The third panel should be showing ACARS, and this is a perfectly normal indication. And we've also got the observer's audio control panel here as well, and he can make the appropriate selections if required, say if we've got a relief pilot on board if it's a long flight. Moving down to the passenger signs, the no smoking signs are always left on, and the seatbelt signs should be on as well, but we leave them off while we're refueling, and we only turn them on when the refueling has completed. So once we've been told that the fueling is finished, usually when the fueler would come up to the aircraft and or get on the interphone and tell us that the fueling is completed, then we can switch the seatbelt signs on. We'll leave them off for now. And then we would finally test the evacuation command feature. We'd get on the PA and we'd warn the cabin crew that we were about to do the test, which sounds the evacuation alarm in the cabin. And this would also serve as a test of the PA. And once we'd done that, then the cabin crew could call us back to tell us that the PA and the evacuation signals are working correctly. So we'd get on the PA, tell them we were going to do it, press the evacuation command, the horn sounds, the light flashes, and the horn shuts off, turns off the aural warning. We then place the guard back on the switch, and the cabin crew will speak to us on the interphone eventually and say that the test was successful. Weather radar panel, again you can make the necessary selections as desired. Generally want weather and turbulence selected, and the tilt and gain can be left in the automatic positions. The rudder trim we want showing in 0, and the aileron trim in 0 as well, and we can cross check this by looking at the top of the control column, which is showing 0, so the aileron trim is centered. And then finally the transponder panel. We haven't had our clearance from air traffic yet, so the transponder's in standby. 2000 is set. We'll get our code from air traffic in a moment, and the transponder selector is usually selected to the side that the pilot flying is sitting on. We're flying from the left hand seat today, so we'll use the left function. So that's it, that's the panel scan done really. Now at this stage we'd start initialising our ACARS system, and we do this through the ACARS feature on the control display unit. This isn't fully simulated at the moment, although I believe that PMDG are coming up with an application which is called Global Operations, and this will hopefully allow for a full and realistic simulation of ACARS operations. In real life we'd initialise the system and would also be putting our initial estimated loading information into the system. In the absence of this though, in the meantime, we can treat the payload page of the FS Actions section as our ACARS load sheet application. So we can put the estimated weights and our various loading figures in as appropriate. We today have a 0 fuel weight 204.8 estimated on the flight plan, and this of course may change when boarding is complete and the final load sheet information is received, and that's usually just before pushback. So that's it really for the panel scan. All these switches and buttons are roughly in the right place, and now it's time to set up the FMS, and we'll look at that in the next video. Cheers folks.